Mariupol has basically been encircled, surrounded. The Russians have basically taken the urban areas. And as far as reports are going, and I guess we have to talk about this in two ways. What do we know? And what are people saying? And I guess going with the first thing, what we know first, at least Western sources are reporting also that Russians have basically taken Mariupol, with the exception of the steelworks. Now, that particular factory is apparently the last stronghold of, I guess you can say, Ukrainian forces, the most fanatical of the fanatics. And this will be a major blow to all of these claims that the West are making that Russians are basically not accomplishing their objectives. It is the weirdest thing in the world to live in this country. Most of the people are just getting the news from this country. At the point where you're getting news from, let's say, China or other countries in general, Russia itself, even looking at stuff that the Ukrainian military is putting out, and yeah, also the West, you get a larger context of what is basically taking place. And when you're looking at that larger context, looking at what they're saying here looks completely weird, completely, entirely weird, especially along this notion of, well, what is happening on the ground, what is basically being reported, and what is being reported in the context to the relation to that stuff. Meaning, if I'm seeing a large number of materials get destroyed, if I'm seeing a large force that was there, one of the major militaries, basically get annihilated, if Russia says we basically want to create a land bridge to the Crimea, Mariupol is the objective to accomplish that, and they basically take Mariupol, I don't immediately come away with that thinking Zelensky is killing it. I don't think that with that basically taking place. And yet, the Western media will report two contradictory things. One, an impression that Ukraine is doing great, and two, an impression that Ukraine is being utterly annihilated. I don't necessarily know how they bring those two things together. I suppose framing, and people have short memories. All things being equal, though, in this very specific case, the force in Mariupol has been completely degraded. And the last remaining troops that are basically there are out of munitions, out of food, out of provisions, and at this point, like I said, are completely surrounded. Russia issues a demand for surrender. We demand you surrender, and we will give you a time frame for you to lay down your weapons and come out. That has basically been told to kick rocks. That somewhere along the way, somebody in Kiev has decided that those people, remaining 800 at the way that the Russia are putting the number at, are better off being annihilated as opposed to having them throw down their arms and have their lives saved. This is dark, dark stuff. This is where we are. I'm going to go into what we know, and I'm going to go into what the Russian military is saying, and I'm going to go into what is more likely to be true, just based on, I guess you can say, the information available to us. Welcome to the Soapbox.
Hey, I'm here at Mount Shasta. We're at the UFO convention.
My name is Jamarl Thomas. This is the Progressive Soapbox. Guys, if you dig this content, like, share, and subscribe. You can always support this through PayPal or Patreon. That is darkly funny. That is darkly funny. Last video I did was a UFO video. And so that's where that particular opening, it's like, okay, now I need to transition into a lot of people being killed, and that is just weirdly funny and yet dark. All right, Mariupol. Let's talk about Mariupol. Also, by the way, Russia put out numbers of the number of casualties up to this point in the Ukrainian military. Those numbers are staggering. Those numbers are staggering. And look, between Zelensky numbers of like 3,000 or some ridiculously low number, or between the Russian numbers, I suspect it's probably more towards the Russian numbers, considering the number of materials and everything else and the disadvantage of force, not to mention Russia has been taking cities, and Ukraine has been doing pinprick strikes at best. But let's go into the thing. So last week, this came out in The Guardian, Western publication, right here. Last Marines defending Mariupol running out of ammunition. Last Marines in Mariupol running out of ammunition. All right. Quote, this is them. They were posting this on Facebook. Quote, the enemy gradually pushed us back. They surrounded us with fire, and now they're trying to destroy us, unquote, Marines posted. The mountain of wounded, amount of nearly half of the brigade they added, with those whose limbs are not torn off, continuing to fight. The infantry soldiers had all been killed. The, quote, shooting battles, unquote, against the Russians were now being conducted by artillerymen and anti-aircraft gunneries, as well as radio operators, drivers, and cooks. Even munitions from the orchestra were fighting, they said. This is Western publication. So this is them telling you exactly this is the situation on the ground. Half of our people have been killed, and for the most part, the people who are fighting are basically, or half our people have either been wounded, the majority have been killed, and we even got to the point where basically cooks are picking up weapons and fighting. We're out of ammunition, and we're running out of supplies. That was last week. All right. So the Russia puts out this. Up to 400 foreign mercenaries are blocked at the plant. If they do not lay down arms, they will be destroyed. And this is, the Ukrainian authorities have banned formations. Again, this was Russia's side. The Ukrainian authorities have banned formations of the Azovstal plant in Mariupol from surrendering to Russian troops, Russian Ministry of Defense spokesman Igor Konoshkinev said in the briefing on Sunday. Up to 400 mercenaries are blocked, basically trapped in this plant, and will not lay down their arms. So if they don't lay down their arms, they will be destroyed. Quote, the Ukrainian group surrounded and completely blocked in by Mariupol on the territory of Azovstal metallurgical plant was asked to voluntarily lay down their arms and surrender in order to save their lives. Konoshkinev said. That name is rough. Right here, quote, in total, according to Ukrainian servicemen who surrendered, up to 400 foreign mercenaries are now surrounded in the territory of Azovstal Enterprise as part of the Ukrainian group. Most of them are citizens of European countries as well as Canada, Konoshkinev said. He stated that radio communication between pro-Ukrainian forces in Mariupol are conducted in 6 foreign languages. Quote, in case of further resistance, all of them will be destroyed. That is very clear and unequivocal. So, what do we know so far? Again, we know that the urban areas of Mariupol have basically been taken. We know that the last remaining fighters are basically isolated in this, I guess, metallurgical building or plant. We know that the troops are out without munitions, food, provisions, etc. We know that Russia ordered surrender, and we know that up to this point, they have not surrendered. Those are things that we know. When we get into the issue of numbers, that's when we get fuzzy, because we don't necessarily know that as a flat fact. This is just what's being reported. Russia's calling mercenaries. Of course, all of these are people who basically are coming from foreign countries. Mercenaries. Okay. Here is another thing. I'm trying to find the numbers. Oh, there's an explosive part of this that Russia's reporting. So right here, they're basically saying that communications were coming out of, let's say, the steel factory or metallurgical factory, and that the people there, the fanatics, were requesting that their situation was hopeless, that they were running out of pretty much everything, just like I reported, even from Western publications, and that they wanted to surrender. Again, Russia's point of view, this is what they're saying. Quote, within April 16, 2022, a sharp increase was recorded in the intensity of radio communications of militants from nationalist units and foreign mercenaries blocked in Mariupol at the Azovstal metallurgical plant. The content radio interpreters, there were interceptions, there were 367 of them alone in the past 24 hours, indicates that militants offering resistance are in a hopeless situation, practically without food and water. They urge permission to lay down arms and surrender from Kiev authorities. Meanwhile, representatives of Kiev authorities categorically forbid them to do this, and threatened with subsequent executions under wartime conditions, the statement said. Think about that. Basically, the people are there in a hopeless situation. They're running out of food and everything else. They're completely surrounded. And the question that people ask in this situation was, well, wait a minute. Why don't they surrender? This is a hopeless, completely hopeless situation. You've been encircled. There's nothing you can do. You have no more weapons with which to fight. And in asking Kiev to surrender, Russia is basically saying we intercepted communications that basically forbade them to do so. Basically, that your job at this point is to basically be annihilated. Look, I don't know if those communications are true or false or not. I do know, as a flat fact, that those people have not surrendered. And whether these are just the most fanatical neo-Nazis in the group, whether these are Ukrainian military, I have no idea. It's Azov, so of course, some of these guys are fanatics. I guess the point that I'm getting at is, we don't know, as a flat fact, if this is correct. What we do know as a flat fact was that they did not surrender. That we do know. Meaning, the desperation and everything else, that part seems to be basically just true. The reason and rationale for them basically not to throw down their weapons and walk out, especially since they were given the opportunity to do so. That's the question. That's the question. And that question goes into the why. And we don't necessarily know the why. That's basically what Russia is reporting. Here's something else. This one has to do with the casualty list from the standpoint of the Ukrainian side. According to a ministry spokesman, the irretrievable losses of the Ukrainian army and other Ukrainian paramilitary formations amount to 23,367. Quote, as of April 16th, only in Mariupol, the losses of the Ukrainian group amounted to more than 4,000 people, Konoshkinov said. And again, this gets into how many people basically died in the various locations. They're saying in Mariupol, 4,000 people have basically been killed. From the standpoint of the totality of the Ukrainian losses, or irreplaceable losses, it's an odd word to use for it, 23,367 people. I don't know how they got that specific of a number, but again, it's what they're coming up with and what they're saying as losses. Now, the question, I guess, that a person has to ask or answer, is it true? Between Zelensky's number of like 3,000, which I think is just comical, he is a comedian in this case, or the number of 23,000, what's more likely to be true? So if you're looking at the number of losses from the standpoint of equipment, again, this is Western source, grudgingly given, I suppose, helicopters, 100% loss, UAVs, 100% loss, aircraft, 95% loss, tanks, 91% loss, air defense systems, 56% loss, armored vehicles, 57% loss, artillery, 43% loss. And this is what, last week? It's only going to get more. I mean, at this point, the Russians have been striking all sorts of stuff. I mean, they've been attacking Kiev, Lviv. There have been plants, apparently, to create weaponry and whatnot. Those things have been hit. I think, if I remember correctly, some of the stuff I was reading, it was like hundreds of places were being hit over the course of the last 24 hours. It seems like they've expanded the campaign of basically decimating the Ukrainian military. From the Russian side of it, helicopters, 14% loss. Armored vehicles, 11% loss. Aircraft, 11% loss. Tanks, 6.9% loss. Artillery, 6% loss. UAVs, 18.8% loss. Meaning, none of the Russians' losses go above 20%. And even within the context of that, the overwhelming majority of those barely go above 11. Or I think 14 is the second highest. But after that, they hit 11. Armored vehicles hit 12. My point is, nothing goes above 20%. That's a big difference. I mean, and the question I guess you have to answer is, are there people associated with these devices? Meaning the helicopter isn't flying itself, or the UAVs aren't flying themselves. And the locations where those people are basically using those things are going to get hit. And as those things get hit, people, combatants, die. It's a war, after all, right? I guess the point that I'm making here is what more likely to be true. The fact that all of this stuff is basically being destroyed. And at this point, even more have been destroyed at this point. And it will there be people attached to those things being destroyed? I guess my answer is yes. Mariupol has fallen for all intents and purposes. How many people were basically there? Were there 4,000? Were there thousands of troops there? Well, yeah. Have those troops basically been destroyed? The answer is either destroy or surrender? Yes. I guess my point is, I have no idea whether the number is 23,000, but I suspect that number is more towards the 23,000 as opposed to the comically ridiculous 3. I'm going to say like, I'm going to say share, and I'm going to say subscribe. Thanks all.